I thought it would be fun to do a video about why communism is absolutely impossible and why it always devolves into fascism. Because I'm noticing that some of my friends, smart people, actually some of the smartest people I've ever known, still have a fairy tale belief in communism as a thing that has never been done correctly before, and sometime in the future it will eventually be done correctly. Oh boy, this is a fun one. Let's start with the most basic issue of communism. Its most basic issue is the assertion that laborers, aka workers, who do routine tasks in a society are the most noble people, and that the world should be built around their image. That is the very first assertion of any communist platform, and it is the most false assertion that anyone could hold up. Um, let's talk about the Soviets and Russia and how this became an immediate problem. Uh, so the Soviets were labor organizations surrounding manufacturing in Russian cities. And these were labor councils, mostly focused around engineering and operations, such as, let's suppose you had an automobile factory. The Soviets would be selected among all of those people who were successfully tenured, that had proven that they had skill, had proven that they were reliable workers that contributed net value to manufacturing. They were not failures. They were not just initiates or frontline first year, second year people. Okay. So the Soviet councils focused on people who had a middle class to upper middle class upbringing, intellectual capacity. You're talking about people who probably averaged around a 120 IQ, not a 100, and this is very important. And these were a middle class group of some privilege for their time. We're talking about, early 20th century Russia, where a small percentage of people could attain that status, and they were urbanites in a mostly rural country, okay, where 80% of the worker base were still agrarian, okay? And the argument was, and this was the same argument in Eastern European communism in general, basically everything east of Berlin, was that the agrarians were not the labor class. The agrarians were not civilized enough. They were not intelligent enough, capable enough, educated enough to self-govern. Furthermore, the argument was that the Soviets were able to self-govern because, for the most part, they were techno-dominant industries where the people who created the automobiles and created the manufacturing and the assembly lines and the engineering were essentially able to self-manage because they had the technical chops to manage a high-tech, for its time, industry. So they didn't need to be managed by untechnical people, non-technical people at the time to be able to successfully produce an automobile. They didn't need a headquarters staffed with marketing and finance people. If everyone needed an automobile, they sold themselves. They were scarce and highly valuable. And all that really mattered was that they were functional and accessible at the lowest cost and the highest efficacy. So this is a highly technical area. Those sorts of areas have been proven throughout history to be self-manageable. In other words, engineers can self-manage the engineering activities of high-tech work. Even prior to this, in Western Europe, we had examples of engineering groups that developed the early automobile patents. They were decentralized before the internet and even before the telephone. They were mostly connected to each other by conferences, industry conferences, where they would meet up and discuss at those times through that format. The universities where they hailed from, because most of the car engineers, the combustion engineers of the time, all went to like 4 universities that specialized in that style of engineering. And they kept correspondence by mail. And so it was a very small, intimate group of people. There was only a couple hundred people in all of Europe who were able to develop automobile patents. This was an elite, highly intellectual group. We're talking about IQs over 140 in this case, not just 120, but over 140, okay? And they were able to decentralize the process of developing automobile technologies and create patent systems which could have been cooperatively shared rather than capitalistically concentrated into monopolistic competition. And so there was a lot of evidence, even before the rise of Marxism, I mean, not just Marx, but Marxism as an international political phenomenon, that engineers and other high-tech groups could self-manage and did not need a profit motive in order to produce successful innovations. They did it because they loved it. They would be poor and they would still want to do it. They didn't need a profit motive or a financial motive to produce the technologies. They did it out of the love of the technology. And it's true that a lot of the engineers of the 1800s were not wealthy, and that wealth was concentrated into a small number of engineer entrepreneurs who actually successfully put together financial arrangements to mass produce, okay, as opposed to simply invent. So a lot of the early inventors, like Carl Benz, was unable to mass produce. And by the way, he was upper middle class, Carl Benz was, and actually had several successful enterprises from which he drew the funds to develop the Benz, which eventually became the Mercedes-Benz line of innovations. But he was not able to mass produce. It took basically the Daimler, Gottlieb Daimler, and Wilhelm Maybach working together for over 10 years, trying multiple times with financiers to develop a mass production approach to be able to create hundreds of engines to meet demand. And Carl Benz never figured that out on his own. He was always dependent on other people to figure out the manufacturing processes of the innovations he was creating. Otherwise, it would take him an entire he could only build a few cars a year. He never really figured out how to mass produce. And so the thing was that the capitalists who came in to these technology areas were not worried about innovation as their primary problem in terms of coming up with the ideas for an engine or a car or so forth, or the designs for them. They were worried about how to actually mass produce them. And the communists were abject failures worldwide in solving that problem. Worldwide. They simply were unable to think on the right terms to create competitive mass manufacturing facilities. In every single case that a communist attempted to do so, they were financially insolvent, meaning that they were creating net negative value for society. That meant for every dollar that was put into the automobile process, less than $1 was coming out of value. So that the automobile was a net negative impact on the economy when communists attempted to do it. And that means they needed to cover their losses by taking money from something else. And that's where the general problem of profit became so important. The communists used propaganda to convince everybody that profit was always extracted, that it was never justified, that there was never any good reason for an investment to have a positive return. They argued that positive return on investment was always extractive. It was always rentier. And therefore, the only way to solve that problem was to produce any good at exactly zero return on investment. Not because if it's negative return, you run out of money. Because suppose you have 100 different industries in a country, and every single one of them is running a negative return on investment. You're running out of money almost immediately. Your entire GDP is shrinking, which means that everybody is poorer by the minute, not richer, but poorer by the minute, because none of the goods are actually producing net value added. There is no consumer surplus or producer surplus in such an economy. Okay? You are running into the dirt and becoming worse by the minute. Now, suppose instead you have a few industries that are hyper productive and have a huge positive return, and everything else is 0 to negative. What is happening? What's happening is that all the negative return industries are dependent on extracting wealth from the positive return industries in some way, shape, or form to stay afloat. And those wealth transfers are usually achieved by government intervention. So, for example, if the farmers who are producing dairy at a net negative value, that they're selling it at a lower price than its break-even price, it has to be subsidized. And it needs the government to take money from some other pool that is successful and reassign it to the dairy farmers so that they can continue selling at that price. This means they are extracting money from alternative uses in the economy and assigning it to dairy, which the consumers would not be interested in if it were being sold at a market price. The only reason people are interested in the dairy at that is because it's being sold at a loss. And intuitively, people can pick up on when they are gaining a consumer surplus. So, for example, suppose if dairy is $5 a gallon, the demand for it falls substantially. What you do, that is a natural adjustment. People don't want to buy it at that price. It doesn't actually, they have no particular need for that dairy at that price. It's too much for their needs. So they're going to eat something else. And there's a lot of other options than dairy. It's not essential that you eat dairy. Now, all of a sudden, someone subsidizes it. People will pick up on the idea that they're profiting. Their consumer surplus on an individual level is now positive because the dairy is being sold at below market prices. And this means that they could actually extort money from the market by purchasing a subsidized good. Well, this is exactly what goes on in the United States today. We have meat and dairy being subsidized at prices that are unnaturally low, meaning that we are taxing the population to redistribute wealth so that people are going to buy dairy and meat that they ordinarily wouldn't if it was at market price. So back to the point. Communism that argues against profit is claiming that the profit is always extracted. So what they're arguing is they believe in classic economics, that the appropriate market rate is a zero profit rate, which is actually what classic economists argued in the liberal period of the early 1800s, is that if you run an open market with open competition, you'll arrive at a zero economic profit position. And that would occur if there were no subsidies or interventions from the government to create profit, right? And that patents are one of the primary ways that the government creates unnatural monopolies by awarding special monopoly rights to inventors. And this was hotly debated in the United States and in Europe by all of the great thinkers of the time, including Benjamin Franklin, who ended up arguing that awarding patents is the primary justifiable monopoly, which is an issue I'll return to later. But let's get back to the point. The communists, again, argue all rents are bad, all profits are bad, there is no good form of profit. And this is classic communist rhetoric. So let's go back to our economy. How do you grow an economy when there is no net economic value? Okay. Under the communist precept, you do it by quota. You anticipate the future, the exact efficient market supply and demands equation, the exact price, the exact quantity in advance. You have to anticipate the perfect levels of production for every industry to know exactly what the break-even point is where everything is zero profit. And if you guess wrong, you're going to accidentally create profits and shortfalls in each industry. And in fact, this is exactly what happened under Lenin. In Lenin's early years, Lenin attempted to create a command economy that perfectly estimated the exact level of profit for every industry and assigned by quota the right amount of labor, the right amount of resources, capital to hit that perfect number. It was an abject failure. Most industries were wildly off the mark. They were over and under supplying, and they had shortages and shortfalls all over Russia. Nobody could seem able to accurately estimate in advance the correct quotas, and people were dying, and lines were stretching around the block just to get food. And some people had lots of toothbrushes, and some people had none at all. It was a disaster. Lenin realized that he was no longer able to claim that a quota command economy could ever be attained. It was too complex. It was beyond the ability of any human's capacity to compute. And so they gave up on quota systems. And they then created a market-driven economy that simply reallocated everything after the fact. And this was the Russian communist economy. And the Chinese ended up doing pretty much the same thing, which is basically to say, well, we really have a capitalist economy, but after production takes place, the allocations will be reshuffled to make sure that it effectively works like a quota system, so that effectively, we would distribute goods relatively equally to people if they were available at that level. And then if goods are scarce, they will be distributed to party members based on rank and loyalty. Yes, so there was inequality in Russia, in China, because frankly, they discovered that people had unequal talents and unequal desire to work for very hard jobs unless they were rewarded. So they found out that that the way that they could do that is, instead of distribute those rewards based on economic considerations, they would do it based on social considerations. That if you were a loyal hero of the party, then you would get more goods, a bigger house, more freedom, more choices. But you had to do something to set yourself apart as a hero of the party. And so socialist ranking became determined on party loyalty. And so those people who were the wealthiest were those people who were willing to do anything for the party, lie, cheat, steal, whatever. And in fact, this became the history of Russia and China as political engines, was that the more that someone was willing to betray the truth in exchange for propagandist presentations of reality, would get rewarded, and those people who would tell the truth, regardless of the political convenience, would get scapegoated. And the history of Chernobyl was one of the grandest demonstrations of the evils of such a system. That Chernobyl occurred as a meltdown because it was considered party blasphemy to say it was not possible to make Chernobyl successful with the technology, because the party had already supported it publicly and said, we will do this by any means, and here's our goals, and we will achieve that. And anyone who says yes is going to be promoted in the party, and anyone who says no, that's impossible, will be made persona non grata. And as it turns out, a bunch of conscientious objectors said, millions of people could die. This is not going to work. And they were attacked by the party. And this is exactly what happens under a social regime that tries to reward people based on party loyalties, as it becomes a dystopian nightmare of propaganda, where the most important information is suppressed. And anyone who violates the narrative will be attacked, even when the technology cannot achieve the goals, or the economic process cannot achieve the party goals. They will be blamed as being traitors for saying so, for standing up for science and hard objective truth. So let's return to the economic issue at hand. Joe Schumpeter pointed out that the most important way to remain loyal to the spirits of what socialists were trying to achieve, but to challenge their methods and means, was to focus on science and technology. What Schumpeter argued was that there are certain objectives which just simply are not scientifically or technically feasible, and that communists refuse to admit those things. Communists must argue that the political ideology supersedes the technical and scientific realities. And this is where the evil empires come from, is that assertion. So what Schumpeter said was, we know as a fact that progress in the economy since the Industrial Revolution was driven by scientific and technical breakthroughs, not by communist ideology. And that communist ideology could only, at best, decide how to redistribute what science and technology produces. What he argued was that, therefore, the only form of profit which is justifiable is that which creates a better innovation for all people. When a car's miles per gallon for the engine goes from 25 miles per gallon to 30 miles per gallon for the same cost, that is a huge leap in productivity. It is created by the technology, not by communism. That technology will create those gains regardless of the political ideology. So therefore, it must be given credit objectively and independently as being the true source of the value added, not the politics. Okay. Now, the second question comes, after a car's engine is technically improved, who should be rewarded? This is where Schumpeter distances himself from the communists. He argued that the initial rewards for producing the innovation must go to the innovators, not the Communist Party, because they were justly the source of the innovation. We must incentivize innovation that helps people, saves lives, makes the world a better place, by giving some of that reward to the very people who created the innovation. This incentivizes people to solve very difficult problems. And it incentivizes people, more importantly, to form companies, groups, organizations that can come together to solve difficult problems, complex problems, uncertain problems, problems that may take years to figure out with lots of trial and error and lots of innovation, lots of struggle. And therefore, the profit motive of innovating groups is justifiable because of the high risk, the uncertainty, the low percentage chance that they are successful. Because entrepreneurship is very hard. It has a low percentage chance of success. And that means someone has to bear that risk, and someone has to bear the rewards for being willing to take those crazy risks. The entrepreneurs that I've known in my own life have faced many, many struggles. They have usually far more setbacks than successes. As Scott Adams said, he was successful 4 times out of 100 in producing home run innovations, and that the majority of his innovation attempts were unsuccessful and were financed by the ones that were successful. In essence, and some of his innovations were mildly successful, but they were not able to produce real returns. In other words, they were break even or close to it rather than home runs like first base. So the idea was that entrepreneurs deserve some sort of financial reward for the extremely difficult work that they're doing. Moreover, their rewards are often tied up into the organization long term. They are not cash, they are equity. And this means that the entrepreneur is encouraged to continue to innovate by putting the money back into equity. What they're doing is they're providing jobs for large numbers of people, providing incentives to innovate for large numbers of people. And instead of running away with cash and going to the Bermudas on a yacht, to Bahamas on a yacht or something of that nature, the entrepreneur is encouraged to consume modestly while putting most of their money back into productive assets. Okay. Now, how do you tell the difference between the returns to innovation versus rents? Okay. A monopolist who earns rents is charging profit for nothing productive. Basically, for doing the same thing year in, year out, or doing it worse than could possibly be done in an innovative way, a rentier is extracting monopoly over capital, not innovation. In other words, a rentier does not actually earn profit from making the world a better place, such as improving an engine from 25 mpg to 30 mpg, but producing the same 25 mpg engine year in, year out, and continuing to earn large rewards for doing basically nothing new. And the most common form of rentier is the landlord, where they simply own the land. They're not improving it. They're not doing anything to make it a better place. But instead, they're extracting monopoly rents over the renters, holding prices unnaturally high so that they can take without actually improving the land. Okay, that's a rentier. That is a capitalist in the Marxist sense. And in fact, rentiers were attacked by liberal economists all the way back in late 1700s. Adam Smith did not much care for the rentier class, nor did David Ricardo or Sayes. Basically, the classical economists all equally had a problem with the rentiers many decades before the communists. Right? The thing where the communists went nuts was that they insisted that every form of economic activity is rentier based, in a capitalist economy. And this is simply false. What Schumpeter later proved was that the majority of capitalist enterprise was not a rentier activity. It was an entrepreneurial activity. And as such, you weren't taking money from anybody else's pocket. You were creating new value and taking a share of that value, and the rest of it goes to improve everybody. So when the entrepreneur creates a better automobile, there's a consumer surplus that improves the value of the consumer's life. They profit, they benefit, the consumer benefits, okay? The producer also gets a share of that. They benefit. They split the improvements between the two. The world is better for everybody. All stakeholders get some of the value. Some of it goes to taxes, to the government. Some of it goes to trickle into the other industries that are subsidized by government decision making. In other words, the more profitable the top industries are, the more everyone benefits in society. Everyone's getting a positive piece of the pie. This is only true as long as there is true net innovative value, and that value is being shared or distributed. Okay? So every industry, every business which innovates and creates a truly new value added proposal for the world, a proposition for the world, is creating net value for stakeholders, not just the capitalists who invested in it. Therefore, there's enough for everyone. Now, the big decision comes into government regulation and exactly how much value should be given to each one of the stakeholders, the workers, the consumers, the owners, adjacent industries, communities, people who live upstream, people who live downstream of that business activity, and so on and so forth. Where should the value be redistributed? And this is where we get into market welfare economy. And this is the idea that we should put a significant share of that redistributed value to solving the difficult social problems, such as poverty, hunger, medical issues, educational issues, the welfare economy. And this is what the United States and most other welfare economic countries did in the 20th century, is they made sure that a significant percentage of all new value-added activity created some wealth redistribution to those who needed it the most. But such as the Social Security program, which was extremely successful and was groundbreaking for the entire world, but required a market economy for which to function. It would be literally impossible to create a successful Social Security program unless there was no tax and redistribute mechanism where for-profit entities created profit, and then that was taxed and redistributed back in the form of Social Security tax. Okay? If there was nothing to tax, there would be no successful Social Security. That's how it works. Okay? But let's get down to the brass tacks so I can basically end this video. Economically speaking, why is it impossible to create a Soviet-style economy for all? And let me come full circle to the idea of IQ and the ability to govern. Governance is hard. It requires hard work, time, effort, high levels of education, high levels of communication skills. And in fact, the average person in a governance position needs to be able to effectively communicate at the level of a tier 1 graduate university student. This means you need to be in the top 6% of the population who have the intellectual and communication skills to successfully complete governance tasks. It's hard. It's not something that the average worker is trained to do, is proficient in, and enjoys doing. And when the cooperative business movements of the 19th and 20th centuries investigated this challenge deeply, they found out that most co-op businesses were too difficult to govern. They unfortunately found out that professional managers were far more capable of running most organizations than the workers themselves. The workers themselves were unqualified to make the managerial decisions to help lead the company. So what happened was that the most successful cooperative businesses developed a hybrid structure where there were professional managers at the top still. However, they shared governance decisions on specific issues where a democratic vote could help resolve the issue. So, for example, if you work at Publix, which is one of the most successful co-op businesses in the United States, as a worker at Publix, you get to vote on some stuff. However, you do not govern because you are not trained in the specialized managerial tasks and software of the upper management. The upper management is still a professional managerial track with professional qualifications for a hard job. The lower level workers get to have a say without actually having to deal with the hard managerial details. So, for example, they get to vote on a benefits package and the direction of it. It's a labor agreement. That is highly successful. However, any attempt to remove the professional managers at the top was absolutely disastrous. And there are very few cooperative businesses in the world today that have successfully figured out how to remove professional managers from the top. Those organizations that are most decentralized, have the highest average IQ, are high tech, are focused around making high tech products such as software, and are well funded by some source that is not seeking a positive return on investment, because the people who are at the end, the consumers of the product, are usually other businesses, such as Linux, where most of the users of Linux are professional database experts and software administrators of larger organizations looking for an alternative to Microsoft, and so their customers have the money to pay for the workers to be Linux administrators, high tech, highly educated Linux administrators making six-figure salaries. In which case, they don't need to be paid to develop the software part-time, which is what they're doing. They're part-time software developers, because they're already getting a six-figure salary for their administration responsibilities, which is management and is the hardest part of the organization to remove, as I said about Publix. So if you look at all the open source technology groups, they're all dependent on professional managers at the end of the value chain to put it to use in B2B environments or B2G environments. So all this high-tech technology still requires a well-paid manager at the end of the line to administrate the use of the Linux software or whatever technology it is. And this is the hybrid model that has come to dominate the open source world. Produce the product part-time in an open governed format among elite technologists who have a say in developing the technology because they are elite talents. But they get paid by their day jobs as managers and administrators that employ the technology. And how do they justify their pay as being higher than the average worker? You guessed it, they have higher than average skill. Just like every other system in the world, there's only two primary ways you can justify the value of a worker. One, their merit in skill in production, their specialized talents and abilities that earn them a higher pay than average. And number two, political loyalty. And the communists and fascists both employed the political loyalty scheme. So why do you think communism always results in fascism in the real world? Why we never have a real communist regime? Because The only functional form that looks similar to communism is fascism, because it bases rewards on party loyalty as opposed to productivity. So this is why communism always devolves into fascism as a propagandistic system, because they use the same reward structure, which is the outside people who don't use our system are the enemy, they're the bad guys, and we all go to war against them. And the people on the inside are rewarded for their political loyalties, not their objective facts or objective value to the economy or to society. And that sort of loyalty always devolves communism into fascism. Now, if you want to have something that looks like real communism, the closest that you're going to get to it is very small, local, anarcho-socialist trade organizations that are able to produce cooperative business structures and cooperative social structures with direct democracy. Now, this does work on a small level. We have historical examples of peasant societies being able to run themselves as a syndicate, where they produce most of everything needed within their little village, and there's a small amount of international trade. However, they are poor. In other words, they cannot keep up with the standard of living that capitalist societies can produce. The anarcho-socialist farm networks that have existed in history are relatively poor, and they still require the export of some high-value goods to the rest of society at profit, so that they can redistribute that wealth amongst themselves. So they're still capitalists. They're just capitalists who work as a single export group, selling something at high value. So then when they get receipts, they can redistribute that receipts in a way that looks highly equal, but is still profitable. So the anti-profit messaging of communism is absolutely insane. It's simply unsustainable. Now, I could go on and on about this for hours, but I'm going to end the video here because I think I've made the very clear points I've been trying to make. Hope this was useful.